So we will go on with our visit to the world. So we'll now go to the United States of America. You created the organization regarding or dealing with conservation and preservation of picturesque roads or routes.
Everybody have some coffee? I'll wait for the translation. Yeah, cafe. Okay. Roots of memory in the United States. I want to try to put the United States within context of Memorial ALLÉES, and I was thinking yesterday, I watched President Macron's speech at the Arc de Triomphe and was looking at the significance of yesterday as Armistice Day, which we call Veterans Day in the United States. And World War I and the memorialization of World War I in the United States is not as strongly felt and experienced as I've seen in Australia, Britain, France, and other places. I'd like to try to explain my perception of the United States, how we looked at World War I, our response to it from memorials, and how it plays into the larger US culture. You see here an image of a cemetery and a memorial. This is Indianapolis. This is a memorial to the Civil War, which was dedicated in 1902, not that long before the start of World War I. This is one of the largest memorials ever built in the United States to honor the Civil War in the United States. And you can see this was a large daily reminder of the loss and the devastation of the Civil War in the United States. 1921, well after the end of World War I, there's still Civil War memorial parades for the veterans. So I'd like you to understand this context about what's happening in the United States right before World War I. Our Civil War is from 1861 to 1865. Many historians have called this the first modern war in the world. This is the first use of aerial reconnaissance. Balloons were used to survey the troops on the different sides. Because of the telegraph and the railway, troops, supplies, munitions were moved efficiently and rapidly compared to previous wars. The first submarine, modern weapons capable of mass destruction, including chemical warfare during the Civil War. And you can see in the final photograph, right here, photography allowed everybody in the United States to understand what was happening in the war. The romance of the war became very real with the images that were sent back to people outside of the war areas. And this is the United States after the Civil War. Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Southern Confederates. This was a factory and railway in Atlanta, Georgia. Railway station in Charleston, South Carolina. In Charleston, South Carolina after the war. It's major devastation and destruction, particularly in the southern part of the United States. There's a loss of cultural patrimony as well. This is the oldest Episcopal church in North America that was largely destroyed during the war as well. 620,000 war dead during the 4 years of the war in the United States. 116,000 dead during World War I. So you can see there's a very different context in terms of sense of loss and the domestic impact of the war on the United States. And like many wars, we began trying to memorialize and understand even before it ends. This is the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Many of you may be familiar with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a very important document in American history, which was to dedicate a cemetery on a battlefield. And we began developing cemeteries immediately before the war was over. This is one in the 1860s in Mississippi. And one of the previous speakers mentioned Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Arlington Cemetery began as a Civil War cemetery outside of the Capitol for the war dead in Washington, D.C. The cemeteries happen right away. Memorialization of the war takes a while longer. And I think this is very important context. This is the memorial in New York City, which is dedicated in 1902. There was a long delay about what was appropriate, who was going to pay for it, where it should be located, typical things that we find with a memorial. The memorial in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, one of the largest constructed to recognize the Civil War, dedicated in 1910. And in 1912, just 2 years before World War I begins, they dedicate the memorial in the city of Philadelphia. So you can see, as war is beginning in Europe, the United States is just finishing its views of its own war, of its own Civil War. So in 1914, the war begins. The United States doesn't enter the war until 1917. We know that story, Armistice Day, and then a brand new war to figure out how to honor, how to recognize, and how to memorialize. I suggest to you that memorial trees, memorial avenues, memorial allées were well timed with America at this period right after World War I, based on our culture, based on our own Civil War, and based on changes in the American landscape during this period. And I think this was a perfect opportunity for memorial allées to be considered. Once again, there was a sense of loss, and as one of the speakers just mentioned a moment ago too, in Canada, the loss of youth, young men and young women going off to war. So this is again the sense of having just buried and recognized people from the Civil War, and now another young generation is being lost as well. African American troops as well. These are some African American unit marching toward Verdun in 1918. And you can see them walking down the avenue here. As we've been hearing today, the idea of these avenues in the landscape and the memories of the soldiers with those landscapes of trees. American Forestry Magazine. Trees will be in their very greenness and robust strength, reminders of the youth who gave their vigor to win the war. So the idea of trees recognizing young people, again, if we just look back, we spend a lot of time and money building stone memorials. We want to think about it something different this time going forward. So, American Forestry Magazine, Roads of Remembrance, and they began talking about this very early on in terms of ways to recognize the American soldiers in World War I. And I share this with you. The American Expeditionary Forces received many impressions of Europe unrelated to war. One of the most permanent and important of such impressions was the striking beauty of the French highways. Wherever the American doughboy traveled in France, he almost always found the highways lined with trees. Trees that adorned the landscape and added a pleasing diversity to the endless kilometers. The American brought back the picture of this feature of the French countryside, and it will never fade from his mind. This is the argument for memorial trees in the United States. It's an impression, it's a memory of Europe that's unrelated to war. So it's a favorable memory of the place where our soldiers came that can be brought back that's not related to the war. It's permanent and important, which is what all memorials should be, permanent and important. Trees that adorn the landscape. It's an object, it's an element in the landscape that makes it more beautiful in terms of memory and honor. And it will never fade from his mind. It's permanent, it's lasting, we will always remember. The first city to develop a memorial allée was Cleveland, Ohio, and they began in a year before the war ended. Cleveland was one of the largest cities in the United States during this period. It was growing rapidly, wealthy, and that's Cleveland's recently dedicated Civil War Memorial in 1894. This, I think, works well in terms of what's happening with the American city during this period. American cities are growing, population's growing, and American cities are establishing metropolitan park areas. These are park plans, not just building a single park like Central Park, but looking at connected parks that follow the course of rivers and streams, that connect to larger park areas. The spaces between the narrow lines are called parkways, narrow strips of parkland that connect larger parks. This idea of these metropolitan plans is being developed right around the time of World War I. And you can see here in Cleveland, one of the parkways here, which was North Park Boulevard, gets rededicated as Liberty Row in 1918 with a series of memorial oaks for the soldiers from Cleveland that fought in World War I. The oaks were dedicated, and each oak had a bronze plaque with the name of the soldier who had died in the war. This was not only a nice memorial opportunity, but because it was in the park system, it was in the larger context of a green and permanent place that was always going to be growing and thriving, going back to the idea of trees, growth, and recognizing youth. Similar in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, in the north central part of the United States, a large industrial city, but also with a very sophisticated park plan that they started doing in the 1890s. This is one of the parkways that connects the park systems. Usually the parkways had drives in them. And this is the plan for the Cleveland system, just like you saw, for Milwaukee. Just like you saw in Cleveland, there's a series of linear routes connecting larger park areas in Minneapolis, protecting the existing lakes and the landscape. And this one area of the park system, the parkway, was dedicated as Victory Memorial Drive for World War I. And you can see here the plan for the Memorial Drive. Very formal, rows of trees connecting to larger park areas, and then signature spaces here, this very important turn right here, right there. So construction, then the dedication of Victory Memorial Drive. General Pershing came to the dedication. And here you can see Victory Memorial Drive today. The little trees that line the way, sad symbols of a nation's pride, are etched against the wintry gray. Oh, let them live for those who died. Cleveland is a very cold, snowy city. It's a perfect poem for this. So Cleveland and Minneapolis are leading the way, and American Forestry magazine is encouraging Americans in large cities and small cities to invest in trees to remember the war dead. And you can see in this article here, not only to talk about trees and list famous people who are supporting the effort, all through here, including the President of the United States at the time, William Howard Taft, and then examples from newspapers around the United States encouraging communities to go out and plant trees. And these are some of the examples of trees that are being planted during the period. Trees on a boulevard in a small town in Illinois, a single memorial tree planted along the Brunswick Pike in New Jersey, and a memorial pin oak from the state of George Washington, our first president, planted in Washington, D.C. So lots of layers of symbolism. So you see the idea of memorial roads and the park systems making sense. The other thing happening during this period is the construction of modern roads in the United States because of the automobile. And an article called Civilization's Highways notes that, shall we have them as streaks of concrete across the country, blistering in the sun, a typical highway, a typical road, or shall we make them roads of remembrance? Okay. So this article goes on to talk about the fact that we've been paying attention to what's been happening in Europe with the roads planted with many kinds of trees. We're familiar with these European ideas as well. But then, we must not forget we're living in a new age right now. The age of the automobile. The high-powered automobile and auto truck have changed old methods of highway transportation. So we want to look to Europe for ideas about the beauty of the highway, but we're also recognizing the new speed and change of the automobile. And right before the war begins, the United States is on a major campaign to build public highways to connect a continental nation. This is a very romantic picture of the first concrete road in the United States. This is really more the reality of the roads in the United States during this period. It's very difficult. We relied on a large rail system, and it did not accommodate the automobile in long distances. So 1909 fantasy, 1909 reality. In 1916, the federal government establishes the first funding for public highways, which means we can start building highways across the United States in all of the states. However, the program was stopped immediately because of World War I, and all the monies went to the war effort and road construction stopped. But we were ready to begin after the war. One of the projects that began just before the war was the Lincoln Highway. This is the first transcontinental highway in the United States, running from New York to San Francisco, 5,400 kilometers. New York to San Francisco, and going through Pennsylvania, among other places. This is an example of that new modern concrete highway. This is the type of highway that people start thinking, maybe this can be not just a new highway, but also a memorial road as well. The highway was already named for President Lincoln. The idea that the highway was linking the country like he linked the country during the Civil War. But it was more than just the Lincoln Highway, it was the new modern highway of travel. And it was a big deal. This is a women's organization in Nevada, getting ready to cut the ribbon on the new highway. This was a major, major accomplishment, and being on this national highway was extraordinarily important. And people started talking right away, should there be a memorial allée from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean? York County, Pennsylvania, let's go back here. Right in here, okay? York County, Pennsylvania decides to take their 25-mile, 40-kilometer segment of the highway in that county and dedicate it as some road of remembrance to the young men and women who died from York County. Local women's organization, as we've heard earlier, women were very involved with this. They put out a call for people to buy trees and organized the whole effort. You can see here, they're located on East Market Street. This is where the women were located, right on the Lincoln Highway. So the idea of being physically on the Memorial Road where their offices were. And here you can see the dedication of the Women's Club of York on 30th May 1922. This is in Wrightsville in York County, Pennsylvania, and that's where the arrow is, right there. 1,500 memorial trees were planted. They cost $2.50 each, which today would be about $30.64 cents. And to finish, my last slide, this is the plaque that is at each end of the county. Lest we forget, this highway for 25 miles eastward across York County was planted with trees by the people of York County and dedicated to them to be forever a road of remembrance in honor of their sons and daughters who served in the World War, 1917 to 1918. I think it's very important here as well, their sons and daughters. It's not just a memorial to the men, I think this is the influence of the women that helped to organize this memorial. So that's a brief introduction to memorial roads in the United States for World War I, and I think the context, which I think is important to understand, why we did them, how we did them, and our involvement with the war. With that, I say thank you. Merci.
Merci. Voilà. Merci, Dame Marriott.